Good evening, everybody, and welcome to History Author Talks. I'm so glad that you can join us this evening. We've got a wonderful show this evening, and I am so pleased with not only our authors that are going to be joining us, but also we have Kathleen Ford from George Washington's Mount Vernon. I will introduce Kathleen in just a moment. First, I just wanted to let you know a few housekeeping issues before we get going. As always, my regulars will know that the way our show works is that people will use the chat feature that's at the bottom of your screen to send me your questions for the authors, and I will then forward your questions to our guest host, who I will introduce in just a few minutes. If during the show, you will also get chat messages from me that will include the authors' websites and where to purchase not only their books, but other books on the same topic. If you have questions for me directly, you can always ask me those questions. And beyond that, I hope that you enjoy our wonderfully terrific show. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you to our partner in history. Our partner in history this evening is George Washington's Mount Vernon. We have with us Kathleen Ford, who is the manager of historic interpretation at George Washington's Mount Vernon. And she was kind enough to give us an hour to tell us what's going on the banks of the Potomac. So I turn it over to you, Kathleen.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. This is really a thrill to be able to just take a few minutes here at the start of the program to share with everyone all of the exciting things that are happening at Mount Vernon. I'm sure many of you have been to the estate before, but especially during a pandemic, things are always changing. So I just wanted to share a little bit about the things that are happening now. And to start, a lot of people assume that we are closed, but we have been open since last summer. We're open every single day of the year, but we have taken, of course, many safety precautions during the pandemic to really emphasize, distancing, enhanced cleaning. We are enforcing, of course, all of the CDC recommendations in the guidelines from the state of Virginia. So while on the estate, all of our staff and guests are wearing masks and maintaining social distancing, staying to smaller groups. And that actually does include our mansion tours. We have had to make a lot of changes to be able to tour the mansion safely. For those of you who've been there before, the rooms are quite small. So we have made it so that the tour is only going through the first floor right now, where the rooms are a little bigger and allow for more distancing. We have all of the doors open to allow as much airflow as possible. And we're actually doing all of the interpretation and the experience of history outside as much as possible. So we have the small groups of 10 that still get to experience Mount Vernon, still get to go inside the mansion, but really in a manner that's as safe as we can possibly make it. Because of this, we have been able to operate safely for almost a year now during the pandemic. We have, of course, our mansion tours. All of the grounds are open. You can still come and pay your respects to George Washington at his tomb, for example. And we have a number of specialty tours available on weekends. Everything from a tour, a new tour actually to this year on the Hamilton musical, to a tour that also covers the enslaved people of Mount Vernon. So many different things that you can come and experience on the estate. We do have a number of special events coming up in the next few weeks. I thought this group may be interested in. On May 1st and 2nd, we have our annual Revolutionary War reenactment weekend. So a number of reenactors come to the estate for the weekend. They actually camp on the estate overnight too. And we have a number of military demonstrations and horse demonstrations to go along with that. In June 25th and 26th, we'll be doing our Independence fireworks events. We do that the weekend before the 4th of July, so you can come out and see some fireworks at Mount Vernon. And we have our wine festival in July this year, 16th through the 18th. But I know for many of you, traveling, of course, is still not an option. And we are trying to reach as many people as we possibly can, even during the pandemic. So we have transformed many of our programs into virtual options. The one that I find really still has the most educational objectives and outcomes for adult groups. We do offer virtual VIP tours. Those can be really anywhere from a small group of 5-10 people. I've done ones for 500 people though. And then you get a history expert like myself, or maybe one of our character interpreters that can actually give a group a tour of Mount Vernon virtually. So this is a really great way to be able to still share the story of George Washington and Mount Vernon from people, sitting on their own couch. And if any of you are, interested in, how can my family or my student, the kids in my family, students still experience field trips, we actually do have distance learning options too. All of these descriptions are available on our website, but we have distance learning programs that cover George Washington's leadership, that cover primary sources and how to use those as a young historian. So yeah, plenty of ways to still stay connected to the estate while staying home and staying safe. And then for this particular group too, I do want to mention that we do book talks at Mount Vernon as well. Usually in years past that those have been in person, we've transformed all of those virtually. So I'll link that into the chat in just a minute if you're interested in those book talks. And I just wanted to also, include, in general, how thankful we are to everyone across the country that has supported Mount Vernon in the last year. As you can imagine, historic sites and museums have had a hard time during the pandemic, and we have just been so grateful to the support of history enthusiasts and people from around the country that continue to stay engaged at Mount Vernon. And if you are interested in staying connected to the estate, we do have membership options. These membership options, do of course allow things like free admission to Mount Vernon, but they also allow for access to things like these book talks for free too, like members only events. And it does help to support Mount Vernon in that way too, in our educational and preservation opportunities across the estate. So yes, I'm happy to be here, and thank you so much for giving me a few minutes to share some information about Mount Vernon.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. I really appreciate your time and telling us all about what's going on. And Kathleen, all the chats come through me. So send me whatever you want, whatever links you want me to send out. I will send those to everybody. I've already posted the George Washington's Mount Vernon link, but if there are specific links you want to send, I'm happy to post those for everybody as well, and post them on History Author Talks past shows when the show is over. The show is being recorded, so you will be able to see the recording of this show if you want to share that later on. So I just want, and Kathleen mentioned something about supporting George Washington's Mount Vernon with membership. I encourage everybody to support all their historic sites and museums. Of course, the Museum of the American Revolution and your local historic sites. You want to be sure that you support all of our historic sites. So with that being said, I now would like to introduce our guest host. Tony Williams is a senior fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute in Arlington, Virginia, and he is the author of 6 books on the American Revolution and the founding, including Washington and Hamilton, Alliance That Forged America, and Hamilton, An American Biography. He's a frequent contributor to the Law and Liberty blog. He is, and other websites as well. He's currently working on 2 books on the American founding, including one on the Declaration of Independence and one on immigration and the American Revolution. He lives in Williamsburg, Virginia, with his wife and children. So with that, I am pleased to turn this over to Tony Williams. Tony, over to you.
Roger, thank you so much for having me on again. I'm honored to be back, and this time as a host, and with several fine historians on the panel as well. So it's really my great privilege to introduce Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, who is an expert on the cabinet, presidential history, and U.S. government institutions. Currently, she is serving as a scholar in residence at the Institute for Thomas Paine Studies at Iona College and senior fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies. She is the author of the award-winning The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2020. Her writing has been published on CNN.com, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, USA Today, The Hill, and more. So now it's my great privilege to introduce Lindsay, and I believe she has a short presentation for us.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. I appreciate that introduction. And Roger, thank you for hosting. It's a real treat to be here today chatting with you about the cabinet and George Washington and history in general. I should also say that just for some context, if you look in my footnotes of the cabinet, you will see the name and the titles of my other co-panelists today, David Stewart. So it's a real delight to be able to do this event with him because I have read so many of his books. So that is a fun little bit of overlap for me anyway. So it's important whenever we're talking about the cabinet that we start with the Constitution, because if we look at the text of the Constitution, the word cabinet is nowhere to be found. And that was very intentional, as the delegates to the Constitutional Convention were very concerned about a cabinet and its potential for corruption and cronyism. And so they explicitly rejected several proposals for different types of executive councils. Of course, they included other options in Article 2 for the president to get advice and support. They were reasonable men after all, and they knew that no person can govern alone or without the advice and support of others. And George Washington, as the president of the Constitutional Convention, was very much aware of these expectations. He knew that the first president was expected to govern with these specific other types of advisors and was not supposed to have a cabinet. And since everyone pretty much knew if the Constitution was ratified, he was going to be the first president, he knew that that was what was expected of him. And when he went into the office of the presidency, he fully anticipated that he would not govern with the cabinet. He really tried these other options. And we can talk a little bit more in the question and answer portion about why those options failed. But basically, he discovered that when faced with the constitutional questions, domestic challenges, international crises, you name it, that really faced the first administration, he needed to hear from multiple different advisors at one time. Very few of the big subjects that faced the first government could just be categorized as Treasury issues or War Department issues or State Department issues. And they often had significant overlap. And so it was very important for him to bring together those department secretaries to consult at one time, and frankly, to also hear what they had to say to each other, hear how they battled through various topics, hear the weaknesses and the holes that they poked in each other's arguments, and then make a decision once he had all of that information. But once Washington decided that he needed a cabinet, there was really no example for him to follow. There had been no previous cabinets, and the British cabinet was something that most Americans were deeply suspicious of. And so that certainly was not a model that he wanted to replicate. So instead, Washington had to rely on his own leadership experience. So often I think we consider Washington either the general or Washington the president, and we tend to put them into these two separate buckets and treat them as two different people. But like all humans, Washington was very much shaped by his previous experiences and the Revolutionary War, and his leadership as the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army was really essential in shaping his understanding about how leadership worked, how he should be getting advice, how he should be interacting with those that he worked with.
So Washington basically copied and pasted his Council of War experiences and the strategies that he used to manage the officers in the Continental Army straight into the executive branch. So for example, when he decided to convene a Council of War and then a cabinet meeting, he would send out questions ahead of time so that everyone knew what the subject matter was. He would use those questions as the meeting agenda to try and keep everyone on track as much as possible. And then if they disagreed, which frankly, when we're considering the officers in his army or the secretaries in his cabinet, disagreement often happened more often than not, he would ask for written opinions to make sure that he heard from everyone, to make sure he understood all of the information, and to make sure he had a written record if he needed to return to it at a later moment. He also used both councils of war and cabinets for the same purposes. So of course, to get advice, but also to build consensus or to obtain political cover for a potentially controversial decision. And Washington really used the cabinet, using these strategies and these methods, as a personal advisory body. So the point of the institution was to support him however he needed it, which meant that one year, like 1793, the cabinet might meet 51 times. But later in the presidency, maybe it would only meet a couple of times because either he trusted his own gut or he didn't really like the replacements he had in the cabinet or didn't trust them quite as much. But this left a really essential precedent for Washington's successors in a couple of ways. So first, as I said, the cabinet is a very intimate, private advisory body, which means that each president gets to decide how those relationships are going to work and how he or she is going to interact with the department secretaries. Sometimes they might be really close to a secretary or two, and sometimes they might prefer to get advice from friends or family members or former colleagues from their business or industry. And how those relationships work and what that advice looks like has very little to do with how Congress or the public might feel about those things. And those relationships tend to take place with very little congressional or public oversight. And I would argue that this is actually one of Washington's greatest and also most underappreciated legacies and precedents that he left for his successors was the creation of the cabinet and then its ability to be a flexible institution in all of the potential opportunity or potential downfalls or pitfalls that might accompany that flexibility as well. So I will now turn it back over to Tony so he can introduce our other historian, and I really look forward to your questions towards the end. That's always my favorite part of these presentations because I want to know what you want to know about, and I want to be able to share more information about those things. So thank you again for being here. I appreciate it, and talk more soon.
Thanks, Lindsay. That was fascinating and it only made me want to listen to more. So we'll eagerly get back to you after David goes. And so now it's my great honor to introduce David Stuart. And after many years of practicing law, David became a best-selling writer of history and historical fiction. The Wall Street Journal called his recent George Washington the political rise of America's founding father, which is right here. They called it an outstanding biography with writing that is clear, often superlative, and a narrative driven such a life deserves. His other histories have explored the writing of the Constitution, the gifts of James Madison, the Western Expedition and treason trial of Aaron Burr, and the impeachment trial of President Andrew Johnson. And I read them all, by the way, and go ahead and read them in any order, but read all of them. You won't be sorry. He has won the Washington Writing Award, the History Prize of the Society of the Cincinnati, and the William H. Prescott Award of the National Society of Colonial Dames of America. He has also written the Deception series, which includes 3 historical mystery novels. So without further ado, David, if you'd like to start your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Tony, for the introduction, and Roger for having me here. It is a pleasure, and it's a treat to be on with Lindsay. Her book came out before mine, so I was actually able to rely on her book. And in particular, I have to flag, I kept finding through Washington's life that he had this one nemesis who just kept turning up and annoying him and just being in the way, a fellow named Thomas Mifflin, sort of a footnote in history. Nobody pays much attention to him. But it was clear Washington really didn't care for him. And nobody ever mentioned this. And then finally, I read in Lindsay's book that she noticed it too. And that affirmation was very helpful to me. It's always nice to feel like you're not the only person in the room who noticed something. And I also want to do, this is a point of personal privilege, a shout out to friends who I think are here only because it's me. And so Marianne and Billy and Dean, thank you. I appreciate that. The book grows out of something I noticed, which others had noticed, which of course is Washington won 4 key elections in his life: commander-in-chief of the Army, president of the Constitutional Convention, and president twice. But he won them unanimously. And I wanted to sort of dig into that because that was no more common in the 18th century than it would be today. And you don't get that with box tops. I mean, that's a neat trick. And I wanted to understand how he made that happen. And I discovered, starting from his early days, that there were a lot of things about him that we think we know that are not true. There's this image of Washington as, a natural success. He was tall, he was a good athlete, he was brave. So everything came to him. He married a rich woman. It was all good. Those are all true, but the success was not instantaneous and was the result of hard work, self-reinvention, self-examination. He was the 3rd son of a planter of the 2nd rank who died when George was 11. George, as the 3rd son, inherited what could only be described as the bad stuff. He didn't get the good assets. Those went to the older 2 sons. His mother didn't get anything very good either. And she had to raise 5 little kids as a single mom on not enough assets. And he went to work at the age of 16 because he wanted to make some money. It was just that simple. He was not able to go to school for more than 2 or 3 years. He was always self-conscious about his lack of education, formal education. He was an avid reader all his life and did improve himself. It's fascinating to watch how his writing improves through his career. And he makes connections, and that will be his gift through life, is his ability with people. And through those connections, he gets a wonderful position as head of the Virginia Regiment in the French and Indian War, which he has a couple of great innings at the beginning, and then it all turns sour. He is left out on the frontier with a bunch of soldiers who don't want to be there and aren't very good at what they do, and they're fighting Indians who are extraordinarily good at fighting in the forest. And he has 3 years in a row where nothing good happens. And he ends up alienating all of his superiors within the British Army, also the royal governor who had advanced him. And in 1758, he decides to leave the army and to leave a military career and reinvent himself, having frankly fouled his own nest. He wanted a military career and he wasn't going to have it. He sets off to make himself a successful planter. He's gotten lucky and inherited Mount Vernon at this point. 3 people had to die to allow him to do that, but they did. And he marries, as I mentioned, a rich woman, Martha Custis, and with her money, he remakes Mount Vernon. And he sets off to build a political life. He served 16 years in the House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature, which is longer than he was a soldier. And he spends a decade on the parish vestry. There was a state religion in Virginia at that time. So the vestry, everybody had to go to the Anglican church. And the vestry had governmental responsibilities, including taking care of the poor, which he had to do in Fairfax County. He also spent 6 years on the county court, which had some judicial responsibilities, which sounds a bit odd for Washington since he wasn't a lawyer. But he also had real administrative responsibilities, which was what he always excelled at. They figured out the roads that had to be built and the ferries that would be established, and ran the tobacco warehouses that managed the export businesses. And if any of you has been involved in local government, you know that that's where the rubber meets the road. That's what the issues people really care about, are the issues close to home. And he learned how to deal with people, how to build consensus, and become a leader. He developed also in the House of Burgesses over the years. It's fascinating to watch. When he first gets there, he's unimpressive. He's a lousy orator, and he never is a good one. He's got a poor voice. He's self-conscious and uncomfortable as a speaker. And you know, they have Patrick Henry and fine orators. That's how you became a star there. So he had to figure out a quiet leadership style, which characterized him through his career. There's a wonderful episode I was able to unearth and explore where he tries to bring a legislation to stop the free running of pigs through the town of Winchester, which is out in his district. And you know, when pigs run through your town, they go to the bathroom where they want, and it's pretty unpleasant. They tear into your food, and you're not civilized if you've got pigs running. So it's an easy bill, and he loses it. And it's bizarre that he could lose that bill. And the bill is taken over by Edmund Pendleton, who was a very skilled lawyer in Virginia at the time. And Pendleton reinvents it as a bill to protect the water quality. It's an environmental bill. It's classic 18th century rebranding. And the bill sails through. And I think Washington learned from every episode like that, how to reach people, how to get to the things they cared about. He mastered timing through his career. I think you always see he's got a great sense of timing and patience. He was always a great judge of character, of other people's talents. But he also had what John Adams called the gift of silence. Now, if you're not going to be a great speaker, I suppose you ought to have the gift of silence. And of course, John Adams never had that. But he had the ability to draw people out. He always looked good. He made sure his clothes were the best. He was very fussy about that. He always had a very dignified, friendly demeanor. I was very surprised to discover that most of his contemporaries described him as affable. We see him as this marble, immovable object, when in fact, people liked being around him. And he had an emotional accessibility. He connected with people extraordinarily well. He had, as Lindsay was talking about, a consultative style, which he had to develop. It wasn't his natural way. It was part of the reason he did poorly with the Virginia Regiment in the French and Indian War. He was a bit impulsive and reckless. He would write things before he thought about them, sometimes insulting things. And he doesn't do that when he gets older. And he always wants to hear what other people have to say. He's going to make the decision himself, but he wants to hear what smart people are thinking. And the emotional quality he brings was a surprise to me. One French officer described how he was like a father and a brother to every man. He wept in public on occasion. This is not the marble image we have of Washington, and I think it accounts much more for his success as a politician than we give him credit. I talk about 5 specific episodes in his mature career when I think he showed his great political leadership. Just going to flag them, and if anybody wants to talk about them, let's do that. Ask a question. His time at Valley Forge, when the Army really needed to be reinvented, and that was a political challenge, both within the Army to stave off and a challenge to his authority that came from other officers, and also dealing with Congress, which was essential to his success as a soldier. I think he spent well more than half of his time dealing with politics as a general than he dealt with the Army itself. The transition to peacetime, his resignation from the Army, and the Constitutional Convention itself. I, as Tony mentioned, did a book on the Constitutional Convention, and it was shocking to me to discover that the guy who didn't say anything during the convention, well, he spoke 3 or 4 times. It's not that he said nothing, but he said very little, was the most important delegate. And in fact, without Washington, I think it's less than 50-50 that we get a new constitution. Of course, he established a new government, which was a huge challenge. He kept the country neutral when France and Britain were having a gigantic war, and when that war managed to somehow migrate into American politics and drive many of the conflicts Lindsay was talking about in the cabinet. And then finally, the slavery issue. And I can't really talk about his mastery in the slavery issue because I think it's where he failed. He had an awakening about slavery in his war years. I think the African-American soldiers brought him that awakening. And he spent many years trying to figure out a way to at least get himself out of slave ownership and never really managed it. He did really emancipate many of all the slaves he owned in his will, but he never publicly opposed slavery. And I think in retrospect, that was a huge moral issue for the country where he came up small, and that was a shame. I think he felt it. I think his act of emancipating his slaves was an act of atonement. He wrote at one point, "I hope this would not be displeasing to my maker." I think it was much more a personal act than a political act. So let's move on to the questions.
Great. David, you describe Washington as sort of a somewhat brash young man, impatient, filled with ambition, like a lot of young people are. But you described that he learned moderation, he learned restraint, and he brought this to his generalship, he brought this to politics. Can you maybe dig into that a little bit?
Sure. It's striking when he leaves the Virginia Regiment in 1758. As I say, he's annoyed basically everybody who was superior to him. And when he shows up at the First Continental Congress 16 years later, he's George Washington. He's the guy we all recognize. He's Mr. Smooth, and everybody likes him, and he knows which fork to use, and he's very effective. And I see that as, you got to give him credit, and getting 16 years older helps. We all mellow a bit and learn, that actually we may not be the smartest guy in the room. But he also, I think, had a chance to watch really fine politicians, not people who are household names today, but in the House of Burgesses, you had John Robinson, you had Peyton Randolph, you had Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, Edmund Pendleton, I mentioned, Benjamin Harrison, extraordinary talents. And he watched them operate. He saw how they got consensus, how timing was always essential, that there is a tide in public issues, and you need to watch that tide and understand it. Don't fire your don't fire your weapon early. And I think he also understood the importance of reaching out, and that is what I was talking about, the gift of silence. He really was a good listener. You know, we all know that when we are at a meeting and we get to talk a lot, afterwards we think that was a great meeting. And I think he understood that because, frankly, in all the meetings, most of the meetings he was in, he was the decision maker ultimately, certainly as general and then as president. So he could give people that opportunity, and he had the gift of inspiring trust in his final decision.
Lindsay, you talked about how Washington's leadership in his war councils, his relationship with his generals, helped shape his relationship with his cabinet officers later on while president. And I couldn't help while reading your book in seeing in both cases really the great importance and the model that Washington provides in both instances of deliberation and persuasion and rhetoric, and how important that was in a democracy, in a republic. It really reminded me of all the great kind of dialogues and war councils from Xenophon and Themistocles in ancient Greece and so forth, from Herodotus. And so, can you dial in on why that was so important?
Sure. Well, I think Washington's greatest strength was his understanding of his own weaknesses. As David talked about, he was very conscious of his lack of formal education. And while he was always trying to supplement that with educating himself and reading extensively, he knew he wasn't always the smartest on every subject. And it takes a lot of strength to be able to acknowledge that and to be able to ask for assistance, as well as a real sense of character to be able to bring people around you that have the skills, knowledge, and expertise to provide that sort of input. And so what I found when I was looking through these cabinet meetings is Washington almost never came to a meeting with a set decision in mind. He came with a question, and he asked for their input, and he listened to what they had to say, and he very rarely ruled against. So if, for example, if Jefferson favored one approach and Hamilton, who was the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of War Henry Knox, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph favored another approach, he very rarely sided with one person against three. Sometimes he did, but very rarely. So he had a real sense of sort of democracy in his cabinet. And that's not to say that he didn't have the final choice and didn't have the final decision-making abilities. He did, and they all knew that he did. This was, to be very clear, this was not actually a democracy. It was very much a hierarchy. But he wanted to hear from them. He wanted their input, and he sought it out. And I think that the presidents who have been the most successful, his successors have tried to replicate that model in their own way. Now they've gotten advice in different ways, and they've had different relationships. But when we think of people like Lincoln or FDR, they are people who are not afraid to ask for help and assistance, and that is such an important part of American leadership.
Right. Great, thank you. And David, a question from the audience. Washington set so many precedents, and the two that usually come to mind are, him resigning his military commission to Congress at the end of the war, and also his resignation later on from the presidency after only 2 terms. So can you talk about the political importance of that to civil military relations, to the functioning of a republic, and why it was so different from what was going on in most governments?
Sure. Both resignations are essential, frankly, to our development as a democratic republic. The first was of a piece with the way he had been a general. He always made it clear that he would do what Congress told him to. He would try to persuade them to do something that he thought was smart, but he would follow their orders. It was the first thing he said to them when he was chosen commander-in-chief. And, the wonderful episode when he does resign from the Army, the word, I hope this anecdote is true, everybody tells it, I'm never positive. Benjamin West, an American, was painting a portrait of King George III, and he says, Your Excellency, George Washington has resigned from the Army and he's going home to his plantation. And the king says, if that is true, see, obviously he wasn't quite sure that could be true, then he's the greatest man in the world. And that was the reaction of Americans as well. We all knew, most people knew the stories of people like Julius Caesar or Oliver Cromwell, and the stories that would soon come out about Napoleon and Simon Bolivar. When you lead the army that wins and takes over the country, it's pretty easy to stick around and hang on to power. We've been through an episode just a few months ago with a fellow who didn't want to give up power. And Washington was fine with going home. And boy, did that earn trust. And the same with the resignation, going home after 2 terms as president. That was a great precedent to set because, of course, there was no term limit in the Constitution initially. And the one thing I always try to emphasize is he really wanted to go home after the first term. And he got talked out of it by his friends who said, no, you're too essential. The country will fall apart if you go. And I think he was sorry he hadn't, because frankly, the first term was a lot more successful than the second term. That's a pattern that one of the precedents he did set for future presidents. Generally, the second term is not as much fun as the first term.
Great. Lindsay, another question from the audience. Who was Washington's closest advisor in the cabinet? And what do you think of his handling of the dispute between Jefferson and Hamilton in the first?
These are great questions. So Washington really, he actually didn't have a favorite, and depending on what subject he was talking about and what year we're talking about, he was very close to different people at different times. So early on in his presidency, I would say the first year, Henry Knox was by far the most important, because so many of the issues that were on his plate were relationships with Native American nations, particularly out west. And that was under the purview of the Secretary of War. So he was by far the most important. And he was probably the person who was closest to Washington because they had served together for the duration of the war. And Knox had been one of Washington's favorite generals. Then once the issues become more finance related, of course, Hamilton's going to be the closest advisor because he's the brainchild behind all the financial legislation. But later on in Washington's presidency, once Jefferson has retired and Hamilton has retired, Randolph stays in the office and is actually promoted to Secretary of State. And he and Washington had been close for decades as well. And he was super trusted and was by far Washington's favorite once those others were gone and he had some new replacements in there. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, I sometimes call them the B team because Washington definitely did not think as highly of their abilities as he did their predecessors. And he preferred to meet with just Randolph and not talk to the others. So it really depended on the moment, it depended on the subject and who else was in office. Now, in terms of how he handled Hamilton and Jefferson, I think he perhaps initially was a little bit naive. He really wanted to believe the best in both, and he wanted to believe that they could both see the other as patriots, even if they disagreed on substantive issues. And boy, did they disagree on substantive issues. I mean, they really had completely diametrically opposed worldviews, and that caused them to see the other as a mortal threat. So for Washington, that was actually really helpful. He wanted to have those different worldviews in the cabinet, and he tried to convince Jefferson to actually stay in office longer and said as much that he really wanted to have that other perspective. So it was helpful to him to have that sort of battling and to allow them to, as I said, poke holes in each other's arguments. The problem was that Jefferson wasn't okay with that. Hamilton didn't mind the conflict. Washington didn't mind the conflict. but Jefferson hated the conflict. And ultimately, I think that's really what drove him from the administration.
Thank you. And David, another question from the audience. Thinking about the 1790s, continuing with what Lindsay was just talking about, what is Washington's relationship with his political opponents, some of whom, or most of whom, were friends or maybe former friends? So thinking about Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe, James Madison, what's his relationship with these Democratic Republicans?
It gets pretty nasty. And there's a continuum. Madison has been a close political confidant, I think, for a 5-year period in the late 1780s. He is the most important advisor that Washington has, and even in his first year in the presidency, I think he's terribly important. They do start to drift apart, and I think it's principled. Madison is not happy with some of the legislation that is creating a stronger presidency. Part of me wonders, did he really know Washington? He was obviously a man who was going to create a strong presidency. And Madison's disagreements, though, tended to be in public. He was in Congress at the time, in the House of Representatives. So he would present them as principled issues, and there was nothing devious about it. With Jefferson, excuse me, there was a similar trajectory in terms of becoming disenchanted with how Washington was developing the presidency. But I think Washington tended to view Jefferson as devious and as having betrayed him, frankly. He was in the cabinet, he was in the family, and then he turned on him, and he discovered, of course, the situation with Vernon, the editor who had been being paid by the State Department to write nasty things about Washington. And that relationship, frankly, just ends. And they have no contact afterwards. Washington tries to appoint Madison minister to France after they've, frankly, been disagreeing for several years. He still respects Madison. He still thinks of him pretty well. Not the same for Jefferson, or at least he didn't trust him the same way. With Monroe, it's a more complicated, I'm sorry, I meant to say a less complicated story. Monroe was not of the same heft. He was not as significant a player. And, I think he actually was less in Washington's camp politically. He had opposed the Constitution in the ratification debates. But Washington simply, I don't think, thought of him as a heavy hitter. And so he did appoint him to the minister to France, and was very sorry he had, and ended up recalling him because he thought he had done such a poor job. And so that relationship blows up as well. One of the sad things you find, or I found in his late time in politics, is he always wanted to be above party. And in his last year or so, he is not. He is a Federalist, and then in retirement, he is a real avid Federalist, and he's a partisan. And I think the experience of being attacked was just too hideous for him not to become a partisan. But it's sort of a sad thing to watch.
Right. Lindsay, a constitutional question for you. An audience member wants to know, since there's no cabinet in the Constitution, why does the Senate confirm cabinet members, appointees, and also was the original cabinet approved by the Senate?
Great questions. So in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, it says that the president may request written opinions from the department secretaries, and it says that the Senate will provide advice and consent on treaties and foreign appointments. So that combination of things suggested that there was this concept of Senate approval and there was a concept of department secretaries. There had been department secretaries during the Confederation Congress, but they had reported to Congress. They had been a part of the legislative branch. So when the first federal Congress in April 17, they got together in March of 1789, but there wasn't a quorum really until early April. When the first federal Congress gathered in New York City, one of the first courses of action that they had to take was to create these departments, because the Constitution didn't specify how many there were going to be, what types they were going to be. So they created three: the Department of War, Treasury, and State, and then the position of the Attorney General. And once those had been created, and the last one actually wasn't created until September of 1789, then Washington appointed the first four that I mentioned: Jefferson, Randolph, Knox, and Hamilton. All four of those were indeed confirmed by the Senate, because in creating those departments, the first federal Congress required them to be Senate confirmed. So there's like sort of these tiptoes around what could be considered a cabinet in the Constitution, but it was very explicitly rejected. And so we know that they really intended for there to be these other things, and Washington tried those other things and found that they really didn't work, and so created the cabinet that ended up occurring, and then what we know, sort of the early bits of what we know today.
Okay, great. And David, a person wants to know who has most modeled George Washington's leadership in American history?
I think almost all of our presidents have tried to model his leadership, because he was the man who set the standard. In terms of succeeding at it, that's a tall order, and I'm not sure. I would point to anyone in particular. There are people who try to make the case that Dwight Eisenhower did. He was a former soldier. He operated a bit like Washington in terms of what's called the hidden hand presidency, that he would influence others very strongly, but he would not reveal his manipulations. I'm not entirely persuaded by that. But the different great presidents, and I always try to quote, I think it was David McCullough who said, we remember our great presidents because there are so few of them. Being a great president is really hard. But of our great presidents, they each had such different gifts. You know, Lincoln's gift was language. His political timing were extraordinary. I think in his sense of timing, he is a bit like Washington. His ability to read a situation, but his gift with language is way different from Washington's. You take a president like Teddy Roosevelt, gee, it's hard to find a lot of similarity in their styles. They're very different people. Same with Franklin Roosevelt. So I sort of shy away from the notion that, you know, anybody could be George Washington or reinvent it. I think it's a hard job, and they just do the best they can.
Right. Lindsay, I think we have time for one more question, and a similar kind of question. How does the cabinet shape up during the early republic?
So this is one of the questions that I find most fascinating with my research, because in 1775, most Americans were convinced that the British cabinet, had basically started the revolution. And in 1787, when they're crafting the Constitution, they explicitly reject it. And yet by 1792, so that's just a couple of years later, pretty much everyone knows that Washington has one. There isn't a great uproar about it. And then Adams and Jefferson essentially continue the cabinet, and there's zero question that they're going to get rid of it. And even Jefferson writes a letter in 1801 saying, here are the cabinet practices that I'm going to continue from Washington's first administration. I think these were really important and really great. He said later on, Washington kind of lost control of it and Hamilton kind of took over. But early on, this was, the cabinet worked really, really well. And we're going to model it after his first term. This is Jefferson, who had, explicitly criticized Washington's use of executive power and referred to his election as the Revolution of 1800. And yet here he's saying we're going to continue doing these things. So the cabinet actually remains remarkably stable. And it's not really until we saw a dramatic expansion of the cabinet in the 20th century that a lot of the day-to-day practices actually shifted.
Great, thanks so much to both of you, David Stewart and Lindsay Chervinsky. And I'm going to turn it back over to Roger.
Unmute myself. There we go. Excellent. Am I unmuted? I want to make sure.
We can hear you.
Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. Sorry about that. Well, I tell you, every time I do one of these shows, I'm absolutely amazed. This is so terrific. And I first want to thank Kathleen Ford from George Washington's Mount Vernon, who let us know about everything that's going on right now at this historic site. I want to thank David and Lindsay. Just stellar work. Thank you so much for writing your books and for answering such questions that really make this an interesting show. And Tony, thank you for shepherding the question and answer period. That was just terrific. I want to remind everybody that at historyauthortalks.com, you will see tomorrow, I will post this show that you can share with your friends and family and anyone that you know, but also it will have Lindsay's and David's and Tony's and the George Washington Mount Vernon links to all of their websites. And I encourage all of you, if you haven't bought their books yet, including Tony's, you should contact your favorite bookseller or just look at the link that I've put up there, bookshop.org. Proceeds go to the SAR library. And also check out historyauthortalks.com. I've got some terrific new shows coming up. I don't have them all posted yet. You can sign up to be sure that you get messages about my upcoming shows. But most of all, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Really fantastic questions. And you are all who really make this show terrific. So thank you for joining us. And we'll see you next time. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Roger.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.